December 16th, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The forest is silent beneath a low, gray sky. Snow lies thick on twisted branches and frozen ground, muffling movement. Air is sharp, biting at exposed skin. Boots crunch softly over ice-hardened leaves. A distant engine hum vibrates through the cold, restrained, patient, like the heartbeat of an unseen machine. Soldiers huddle in foxholes and beside fallen trees, rifles cradled, eyes scanning the dim horizon. Their breath rises in clouds, swirling over frost-crusted helmets. Frost clings to gloves and collars, glinting like shattered glass. Between the trees, shadows shift as men shift, nerves taut, muscles stiff from cold, yet unaware of the storm about to break. Above, clouds hang heavy. Snowflakes drift slowly, coating rifles, pack straps, and the frozen forest floor. Silence presses, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch under a cautious foot or the faint whine of a distant engine. The men are focused, alert, but history has not yet announced itself. These are the last calm seconds before chaos. Farther along the ridge, armored vehicles lie waiting, concealed by fog and snow. Their crews check guns, peer through periscopes, adjust tracks. Orders have been whispered down the line, yet every man feels the weight of what they cannot yet see. The cold is no longer just weather. It is a sentinel, patient, unyielding, and indifferent. The forest holds its breath. The men hold theirs. Time seems suspended. In a few heartbeats, the winter will erupt with fire, steel, and sound. Lives, plans, and the fate of armies hinge on the next motion, the next command. The snow waits, thick and silent, for the storm that will sweep across the Ardennes. Context/background, Part 1. Winter had always been a formidable adversary in warfare, but the Second World War exposed its lethal precision. By 1939, armies were forced to confront the fact that snow, ice, and subzero temperatures could determine outcomes as decisively as bullets or artillery. In Poland, the Wehrmacht's invasion was swift in September. Yet even there, frozen roads and muddy tracks slowed armored units and hampered supply convoys. Frost hardened the edges of every operation. Rifles jammed, vehicles stalled, and soldiers' extremities were the first casualties. The cold demanded constant adaptation. Yet preparation was inconsistent. The Winter War of 1939–40, fought between the Soviet Union and Finland, offered a stark preview of winter's potential. Finnish troops, familiar with forests, snow, and frozen lakes, executed rapid movements across ice-covered terrain, ambushing Soviet columns. Camouflage and mobility were decisive. Soviet commanders, confident in numerical superiority, underestimated not only Finnish tactics, but the merciless winter. Vehicles froze, tracks became useless, and thousands of soldiers suffered frostbite. Reports from the front describe men digging foxholes in frozen soil, their spades shattering on impact. Supply lines failed under snowstorms, and units became isolated for days. Logistics, doctrine, and morale all faltered under the cold. Across Europe, militaries recognized winter's operational significance, yet few prepared adequately. Clothing, rations, and vehicles designed for temperate conditions proved inadequate in extreme cold. Lubricants froze, engines refused to start, and radios crackled or failed entirely. Commanders assumed discipline and training could compensate for environmental challenges. They could not have been more mistaken. By 1941, with Operation Barbarossa, the scale of winter warfare became catastrophic. German units advancing into the Soviet Union anticipated rapid victories, but the cold arrived months ahead of schedule. Frozen rivers, deep snow, and biting winds rendered roads impassable. Trucks, motorcycles, and half-tracks froze on remote routes, creating mile-long choke points. Infantry trudged through snowdrifts waist-deep, rifles slicked with ice. Officers ordered advances that could not be supported, and supply columns lagged days behind, creating shortages of food, ammunition, and medical care. Soldiers' experiences reveal winter's physical and psychological toll. Men huddled in foxholes, breathing in clouds of frozen air. Fingers and toes turned purple, frostbite spreading silently. Snow muffled sound, creating deceptive calm before ambushes or artillery barges. Exhaustion accumulated not only from combat, but from survival itself. Shoveling frozen trenches, melting snow for water, improvising shelters. Politically, winter also shaped expectations. Hitler demanded rapid, decisive victories, leaving little room for weather delays. Soviet planners, by contrast, understood the strategic advantage winter could provide. Frozen rivers could serve as routes for mechanized thrusts, snow-covered forests allowed stealthy troop movements, and enemy overconfidence could be exploited. Winter was not merely a passive backdrop. It was a force to be harnessed, a tactical multiplier. As the war moved forward, commanders on both sides learned the hard lessons of frost and snow. Operational planning had to account for environmental attrition as much as enemy action. Weather reports became strategic intelligence. Clothing, vehicles, and supplies were weaponized against the cold as much as against human adversaries. Winter was a test of endurance, foresight, and adaptability, qualities that would decide the fate of entire campaigns. The stage was set. By late 1942, armies on the Eastern Front and in Northern Europe would confront winter not as a minor obstacle, but as an omnipresent, relentless adversary. The coming months would demonstrate how frost, snow, and ice could dictate strategy, break morale, and shape history itself. Context/background, Part 2. By the winter of 1942-43, the Eastern Front had become a crucible of cold, hunger, and relentless combat. German forces, advancing deep into Soviet territory, faced winters more brutal than anticipated. The summer campaigns had overstretched supply lines. Fuel and ammunition were already scarce. When temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, lubricants gelled, trucks stalled, and weapons jammed. Soldiers marched through waist-deep snow, dragging sleds of rations and artillery shells, their boots frozen solid. Commanders attempted to coordinate attacks, but communication lines faltered as radio equipment failed in the frost, and messengers struggled across impassable roads. The Sixth Army at Stalingrad exemplified the deadly intersection of winter, terrain, and strategy. Hitler demanded the city hold at all costs, ignoring the lessons of past campaigns and the environment's power. Paulus's units, confined within a rubble-strewn urban landscape, relied on a tenuous supply line over icy rivers and frozen steppes. Soviet forces, in contrast, exploited winter conditions for strategic advantage. Operation Uranus, launched in November 1942, encircled the Sixth Army with mechanized precision, using frozen rivers and snow-laden plains to channel German forces into traps. Snow concealed infantry movements. T-34 tanks crossed frozen waterways, and artillery positions were masked by drifting white, creating an almost imperceptible but deadly siege. In Northern Europe, the Ardennes and Scandinavian theaters illustrated winter's operational diversity. Snow-covered forests and frozen rivers became both obstacles and avenues for maneuver. Commanders in these regions learned that mobility, previously assumed, could vanish under the frost. Even mechanized units, thought to dominate, became liabilities when tracks froze or engines failed. Small, localized engagements often determined the fate of larger objectives, emphasizing adaptability over numerical superiority. Political and doctrinal pressures amplified winter's influence. Hitler and other leaders demanded rapid results, leaving field commanders little latitude to pause for environmental conditions. Soviet strategists, however, prepared meticulously for winter. Clothing, fortified positions, and supply caches allowed Red Army units to endure subzero temperatures and strike when the enemy was weakest. Military doctrine increasingly reflected these lessons. Winter could be weaponized. Snow, ice, and frostbite became as decisive as artillery barges or infantry assaults. Soldiers' daily experiences underscore winter's relentless cost. Foot marches turned into laborious treks across frozen landscapes. Improvised shelters offered minimal protection against frostbite. Food froze, water sources iced over, and medical aid became almost impossible. Human endurance was tested continuously as men adapted to frozen terrain, improvised weapons, and the relentless cold that neither slept nor forgave. By early 1943, it was clear that winter shaped not only immediate battles, but entire campaigns. Stalingrad, the Ardennes, and northern operations demonstrated that climate could dictate strategy, undermine technology, and break morale. Commanders who ignored the environment paid a heavy price. Soldiers who endured gained an advantage measured not in equipment, but in resilience. Winter was not merely a backdrop. It had become a decisive actor in the theater of war. This understanding sets the stage for examining winter's impact from multiple perspectives: the human, tactical, technological, and psychological. Each angle reveals the profound influence of frost, snow, and ice on both strategy and survival, and prepares us to witness the extremes of endurance and consequence on the battlefield. Angles, Part 1. Human cost. The human toll of winter warfare was immediate and unrelenting. Soldiers on the Eastern Front in 1942-43 faced temperatures routinely dropping below minus 25 degrees Celsius, where exposed skin froze within minutes. Fingers, toes, and ears became vulnerable, often requiring amputation when frostbite set in. Men huddled in foxholes or ruined buildings, improvising insulation with torn uniforms, rags, or the corpses of fallen comrades. Malnutrition compounded the effects of cold. Rations froze, water supplies iced over, and calories burned faster than they could be replaced. In Stalingrad, German soldiers stripped clothing from the dead to survive the night. Soviet troops, while better equipped for cold, endured long marches across snow-covered plains, their boots soaked and feet numb. Frostbite, trench foot, and hypothermia became as lethal as gunfire. Psychologically, the cold imposed relentless pressure. Sleep was fragmented, hours spent shivering in makeshift shelters. The mind turned inward. Hallucinations and delirium were common among exhausted men. Morale became a fragile commodity. Reports described soldiers whispering rumors of relief or rescue that never arrived, clinging to hope as the frost crept into every joint. Even officers were not immune. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion and order when the environment eroded both body and will. In winter warfare, the human body was weaponized against its own side, a constant reminder of the unforgiving season. Tactical reality. Winter transformed terrain into both obstacle and advantage. Frozen rivers became avenues for rapid mechanized movement, but also deadly traps when ice broke under the weight of tanks and trucks. Snow muffled sound, enabling stealthy infiltration, yet obscured vision and landmarks, increasing disorientation. Artillery units struggled to position guns in snowdrifts or frozen fields. Ammunition became difficult to handle, and small arms jammed in the cold. In urban environments like Stalingrad, snow and ice accumulated in ruins, slowing infantry and complicating logistics. Commanders had to account for these variables, adjusting flanking maneuvers, supply lines, and defensive perimeters. Mistakes were amplified. A stalled vehicle or frozen bridge could block entire units, allowing the enemy to exploit bottlenecks. Visibility played a tactical role as well. Overcast skies and drifting snow limited observation, concealing troop movements and artillery fire. Conversely, open plains exposed advancing units to long-range fire, with no natural cover from the cold. Commanders on both sides learned that winter demanded flexibility, improvisation, and patience, qualities sometimes ignored under political or operational pressure. Technological limitations. Cold weather revealed vulnerabilities in equipment. Vehicles froze, engines refused to start, tracks cracked, lubricants gelled, and artillery carriages stiffened. Mechanized units became liabilities rather than advantages when snowbound or immobilized on ice. Small arms suffered, rifles jammed, pistols misfired, and bayonets became brittle. Communications were hampered, field radios malfunctioned, telegraph lines snapped in frost, and runners risked exposure over frozen landscapes. Even uniforms and boots were inadequate. Leather cracked, clothing lost insulation, and standard-issue gloves failed against sustained sub-zero temperatures. Winter stripped technology of its reliability, leaving soldiers dependent on skill, improvisation, and sheer endurance. Engels, Part 2. Leadership Decisions. Commanders faced an unrelenting adversary in the form of winter itself. Orders had to account not only for enemy action, but for frozen terrain, immobilized vehicles, and human limitations. In Stalingrad, General Paulus struggled to maintain cohesion as encircled troops froze in ruined factories and streets. Hitler's insistence on holding positions at all costs left little room for tactical withdrawal, forcing officers to confront impossible choices: press attacks in the snow, or risk being overrun by an enemy exploiting environmental advantage. On the Soviet side, Zhukov and Vasilevsky carefully timed offensives to coincide with extreme cold, knowing that the German army was overextended and ill-prepared. Leadership became a balance of logistics, timing, and human endurance. Every decision had amplified consequences. Misjudging supply, terrain, or morale could cost thousands of lives and hours. Enemy miscalculations. Winter magnified errors. German planners in 1941 and 1942 assumed rapid advances, mechanized superiority, and the ability to maintain long supply lines despite sub-zero temperatures. They underestimated the depth of the Soviet winter, the resilience of Red Army troops, and the tactical exploitation of snow-covered terrain. Frozen rivers intended as obstacles were crossed. Snow-laden forests concealed Soviet movements. In the Ardennes, Allied forces similarly misjudged snow and fog as minor inconveniences, leaving columns exposed to ambushes and artillery. Miscalculations were not limited to strategy. They extended to equipment, rations, and winter clothing. Every oversight became a liability. Small errors multiplied in the frozen battlefield, often proving decisive. Psychological strain. The cold was a constant, invisible enemy, eroding mental resilience. Soldiers suffered not only from hunger, fatigue, and frostbite, but from the isolation imposed by snow-laden landscapes. Night temperatures forced men into improvised shelters or foxholes, where exhaustion, fear, and anxiety intertwined. Morale fluctuated with supply deliveries and news of reinforcements. Accounts from Stalingrad describe soldiers whispering rumors of relief, clinging to hope while watching comrades succumb to cold or enemy fire. Sleep deprivation, compounded by freezing temperatures, impaired judgment. Even experienced officers struggled to make coherent decisions under relentless stress. The winter front was as much a test of mind as body, and psychological strain shaped combat effectiveness as decisively as tactics or firepower. Together, these angles illustrate that winter was more than a backdrop. It was a decisive participant in battle. It shaped human endurance, strategy, and the effectiveness of both men and machines. Soldiers fought not only an enemy across the battlefield, but the frost beneath their boots, the snow on their rifles, and the ice that immobilized their world. Climax/turning point, Part 1. November 19th, 1942. Stalingrad, Eastern Front. The air is brittle. Snow drifts curl along the frozen Volga. Soviet artillery fire shakes ruined buildings, sending shards of brick and glass into frozen streets. Within the Sixth Army, officers in fur-lined coats cluster around maps illuminated by flickering candlelight. Each hand gesture, each muted word, carries the weight of men, machines, and survival. Frostcoats, rifles, bayonets, and vehicle tracks. Ammunition boxes, snow-caked and swollen, threaten to split open under stress. Farther east, Operation Uranus begins. Two Soviet mechanized armies, each supported by infantry divisions, move along frozen plains. T-34 tanks grind across snow-crusted fields, engines spitting black smoke into gray skies. Infantry flanks through snowdrifts, their boots leaving shallow, fleeting impressions. Commanders signal with raised hands, whistles, and the occasional flare. Snow muffles sound, masking their approach from German sentries. Reconnaissance units slip along the perimeter, measuring weak points in the overstretched German lines. Inside the German perimeter, confusion spreads. Vehicles stalled on icy roads create choke points. Units ordered to advance hesitate, unsure whether to push forward or consolidate. Artillery crews struggle to keep guns lubricated. Shells are frozen and jammed in breeches. Officers move among foxholes and ruined factories, attempting to rally soldiers whose fingers are numb, boots soaked, and morale fraying. Communication lines falter, field radios crackle, telephones are frozen, runners vanish into drifting snow. At 7:30 hours, Soviet artillery intensifies. Explosions vibrate through ice and stone, shattering windows, collapsing roofs, and sending shards into streets already littered with frozen debris. German infantry responds with hasty fire, but every engagement exposes frostbitten hands and frozen feet to gunfire. Snow and smoke combine into a gray haze, distorting distances and landmarks. The city becomes a maze of ice, rubble, and gunmetal. By late morning, Soviet forces meet at designated junctions, encircling weak points with precision. German commanders recognize the peril too late. Supply lines are cut, reinforcements delayed, and retreat blocked by both enemy and frozen terrain. Every hour, the cold presses harder. Artillery fire punctuates the silence between drifting snowflakes. Encirclement is nearly complete, and with it, the fate of the Sixth Army begins to crystallize. Climax/turning point. Part 2. November 22, 1942. Stalingrad, Eastern Front. The encirclement tightens. German units, already exhausted and freezing, attempt to consolidate positions within crumbling factories and snowbound streets. Streets are littered with abandoned weapons, frozen vehicles, and hastily dug foxholes. The frozen Volga glints pale gray under an overcast sky. Smoke from burning buildings mingles with drifting snow, reducing visibility to mere meters. Frostbite and hunger are silent killers. Men's teeth chatter uncontrollably, fingers swell, and breath clouds hang thick in the still air. General Paulus, now acutely aware of the encirclement, moves between command posts, inspecting soldiers, issuing orders. His voice, muffled by fur collars and scarves, barely carries above the gusting wind. Reports arrive sporadically, supply trucks immobilized, artillery crews frozen, communication lines severed. The weight of command presses heavily. Units attempt counterattacks, but snowdrifts and icy streets immobilize vehicles. Tanks skid and jam, shells fail to fire, and infantry stumble through waist-deep snow under relentless Soviet fire. Soviet commanders, Zhukov and Vasilevsky, exploit every frozen advantage. Mechanized infantry advances along snow-covered plains, encircling German strongpoints. T-34 tanks maneuver across frozen supply routes, their tracks cutting deep trenches in snowdrifts. Artillery pummels key intersections, while infantry infiltrates gaps under the cover of snow and smoke. German resistance stiffens in pockets, but the cold erodes their capacity to coordinate. Every misstep becomes fatal. By midday, pockets of German resistance collapse. Soldiers frozen, exhausted, and starving surrender or retreat into ruined buildings. Attempts to relieve encircled units fail. The Luftwaffe's airlift is insufficient, supplies drop in drifts of ice and snow, and trucks cannot traverse frozen, cratered roads. Units become isolated, their survival dependent on improvisation and sheer endurance. Even small skirmishes become monumental. A single artillery shell, a misfired round, or a frozen vehicle can redirect the momentum of entire companies. Officers issue frantic orders, often unheard, while snow and fog conceal the enemy's approach. The battlefield has become a chessboard of frost, fire, and human endurance. As night falls, the temperature plunges further. Snow piles against doors and windows. Frozen soldiers huddle in ruined factories, clutching weapons they can barely operate. The weight of winter presses as decisively as Soviet encirclement. The Sixth Army is trapped. Hope dwindles with the daylight. Commanders realize that survival will require more than orders. It will demand extraordinary endurance, improvisation, and resilience against an environment as lethal as the enemy. By the end of November, Stalingrad stands as a frozen tomb for the unprepared and as a testament to the strategic potency of winter. The clash of frost, fire, and human will has reached its irreversible moment. Aftermath, Part 1. January 31st, 1943. Stalingrad, Eastern Front. The winter has left the city scarred and silent. Streets that once echoed with orders, artillery, and footsteps are now layered with snow and debris. Burned-out buildings lean at impossible angles, their walls splintered and blackened. The air is thick with smoke, frost, and the faint metallic tang of blood long frozen in the cold. Survival, for those who remain, is a fragile measure of endurance. Casualty reports reveal the scale of devastation. The German Sixth Army has suffered catastrophic losses. Of roughly 250,000 men originally deployed, only about 91,000 remain alive, and many of these are frostbitten, malnourished, or wounded. Equipment has been destroyed, abandoned, or frozen in place. Tanks, trucks, and artillery are immobilized or wrecked in the snow, while ammunition shortages crippled defensive capability. Field hospitals overflowed. Medical supplies froze, leaving men to endure injuries untreated. Reports note frostbite leading to gangrene and hypothermia claiming lives silently, without a shot fired. Soviet forces, while victorious, also paid a heavy price. Winter inflicted a silent toll. Frostbite, trench foot, and exhaustion claimed thousands. T-34 tanks immobilized by ice, artillery crews hampered by frozen mechanisms, and infantry navigating waist-deep snow suffered alongside the enemy. Yet, careful planning, winterized equipment, and a prepared supply network allowed the Red Army to absorb these losses while maintaining operational momentum. Strategically, Stalingrad shifted the course of the Eastern Front. The encirclement and eventual surrender of the Sixth Army forced German forces onto the defensive. Hitler's Eastern campaign was irrevocably slowed, and the myth of German invincibility was shattered. Soviet commanders leveraged the victory to consolidate positions, reinforce supply lines, and prepare for winter offensives that would push German forces westward. The psychological impact was immense. German soldiers captured at Stalingrad described despair in the frozen ruins, hopelessness compounded by bitter cold, hunger, and unrelenting artillery fire. Officers faced impossible decisions. Men clung to survival instinct alone. Soviet soldiers witnessed the tangible results of strategic planning combined with winter mastery. Frost had acted as both adversary and ally, shaping the battle as decisively as bullets or tanks. The aftermath of Stalingrad exemplifies winter's duality. It magnifies both human suffering and operational opportunity. Frozen landscapes, iced rivers, and snow-laden plains became instruments of war, claiming lives silently and altering the trajectory of campaigns. The lessons were clear. Those who respect winter can survive and exploit it. Those who ignore it perish. Aftermath, Part 2. January 31st to February 2nd, 1943. Stalingrad, Eastern Front. The city is a graveyard of frost and fire. Streets are littered with abandoned rifles, shattered helmets, and the skeletal remains of tanks, half buried in snow. Survivors move slowly, each step a battle against exhaustion and cold. Frostbite stiffens fingers, swollen faces betray malnutrition, and the air itself seems to sap energy. Even the smallest task, a melted ration, a fire started with frozen matches, becomes monumental. German prisoners, captured in the final days of the Sixth Army, are emaciated and near collapse. Accounts detail men walking with frozen limbs, unable to grip weapons, eyes hollow from hunger and despair. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, many would not survive captivity. Medical reports note gangrene from frostbite, untreated wounds, and respiratory infections exacerbated by cold. Winter claimed lives silently, compounding the devastation inflicted by bullets and artillery. Soviet forces, though victorious, also paid a toll. Infantry traversed snowdrifts to consolidate positions. Artillery crews froze while transporting guns, and logistical personnel struggled to deliver rations and ammunition over icy roads. Yet, the meticulous planning, winterized uniforms, and supply caches allowed them to endure, regroup, and exploit German weaknesses. The Red Army leveraged Stalingrad's victory to launch subsequent offensives, knowing that winter was now both a weapon and a shield in future operations. Strategically, the battle reshaped the Eastern Front. German forces were permanently weakened, morale shattered, and operational initiative ceded to the Soviets. Hitler's insistence on rigid defense, even in the face of encirclement, highlighted the danger of ignoring environmental reality. Commanders who misjudged winter paid dearly. Their forces were trapped not only by the enemy, but by ice, snow, and frost that rendered roads impassable and vehicles inoperable. The psychological impact resonated far beyond the battlefield. German soldiers, reflecting on the frozen nightmare, described a sense of futility, where survival seemed luckier than valor. Soviet soldiers, while exhausted, understood the advantage of preparation and resilience. Winter, a constant and indifferent adversary, had determined outcomes, dictated strategy, and reshaped the human cost of combat. Stalingrad demonstrates that winter is not merely a backdrop, but an active participant in warfare. Its frozen expanse becomes both battlefield and arbiter, shaping human endurance, tactical decisions, and the trajectory of entire campaigns. The lessons learned here would echo across Europe, in the Ardennes, in Scandinavia, and wherever frost met man and machine in the years that followed.